Welcome to TradeTheNBI.com. This is John's report is for the 24th and final day before break for Thanksgiving. Of course, Friday's action will still be live, but limited. And, well, it was a precipice moment for the market in a broader sense because we talked about the ABM yellow. We dipped below it and then also below the ABM magenta, which pretty much evened out here going across. And it was critical that the close be above that 63 level because that was sort of the demarcation line. From a reading standpoint, still weak with the NBI magenta still below yellow, but the cross of white coming back below red is enough to stave off any real major concerns of a breakdown of significance at least. And interesting, actually a little bit of short activity. We're having a meeting of the DOC cyan and green, still steel well below, negative 13. So if that cyan continues forward, we could see a little bit more softening. Probably going to see more back and forth sideways. It was quite interesting because the buy didn't come until pretty much late in the day. It was overall weakness throughout most of it. From an NQ standpoint, closing below. So this is the divergence between the two markets. Here you can see NBI red and white both dipping. The white has dipped below. So again, similar constructs, just a little bit weaker this time on the NASDAQ than on the S&P, which was sort of inverted before, but the NASDAQ was a little bit stronger. So it's still not quite blending. Gold, of course, taking a dip on the idea of, just loss of really interest because, again, I think you see a huge flow back into Bitcoin. Gold is something that central banks like to play with a little bit to push price around a bit more. So we see, in this particular case, just the expectations for inflation as well as, in this case, growth limited, and that's caused it to, pretty much do what we thought it would do, which was fill positive extreme, going all the way back to the 167, and it was below that at the open, and perfectly fills that. Again, the euro, everyone's talking about how the dollar should be dying, and yet it's the euro that's pretty much fading. And below the typical range we had around 115 to 113 range has been the norm. So going below that, we got 108 down at the bottom level. That anything below that starts to get a little bit frightening from a Fed standpoint. They'll want to backstop it because getting close to parity with euro would be a nightmare scenario. And this is what I talked about. I had put an article on our Skype chat about the expected inflows and how massive they were and the amount of options that were being traded for this week, and the idea that there'd be notationally almost $1 trillion in stock traded for the week coming up. And my point being was is that if we saw interest rates falling because of investment back into treasuries, which TLT every time it dips, that's exactly what you're getting. You're getting move back into treasuries, and that drives the price lower in this particular case. And so big drop off there, which part and parcel is probably the lead reason for the market really not taking the expected bounce everyone was looking for immediately, simply because of people moving their money into safety. They're staying away from equities, and that puts strain because then you have to have shorts to drive the market higher, and we just haven't seen much short activity. Biden releasing 15 million barrels from the strategic reserve, which is like a day, really didn't do anything for the market. So as far as they're concerned, that's bearish from a discount standpoint because it's not enough supply to do anything. And so oil shot up on that news and expected to go back higher. And again, the longer it just remains at these elevated levels, the higher inflationary pressures are. And those haven't been weeded out from this rise already. You're just going to start to see them take effect in December. And that is where it'll be interesting to see the impact, because that will have negative market impact. We've seen Bitcoin suffering through a lot of this with the white NBI leads on all of these that led to the moves back to the zeros. And then it sort of turned around When we got magenta rising above and then finally pivoted higher, we went green on that and pushed it back up above right at this other previous algo level around 57 because much further below that, at least from a daily, was the 50%, but from an algo level, 51 would be the next range. That would be terrifying. I mean, as if the decline already hasn't been severe enough for a lot of people. And this is where some of that margin that people were operating at and also on options last week was a disaster for most option traders, given the strike that was the most predominant. And if you end up with another disaster, it just eats up some of that liquidity, that excess cash, so to speak, lying around. The Fed would love nothing more than to see it disappear, which secondary way of easing the exorbitant amount of dollars that are out there. And from a 50K standpoint, so it was staying weak throughout most of it, and then a little bit later, after this last MBI white peak and pushed back towards the 0%, magenta moved above and started to capture the strength in that. And then once that popped above 23%, that was in my view, the demarcation line where a move there would be enough to really propel it. And that's exactly what happened, though we're quite at peaks at 46 range, white at 44, so pivot lower of magenta, if white holds above, we'd end up with white above magenta. That would be interesting, and then you would look for the pivots below 33 level as a continuation. So it'll be interesting. This is right at the previous algo, 46.83, 47.02 would be the upside push on that one. You're looking at 175, but that's the post market. So as soon as the market closed, the plus 8 or 9 immediately sold off into that. And what is interesting to me is that the expectation on low volume and just some sloppy trade turned out to be just the opposite so far this week, because we've had some extraordinary days. And here's another one where, again, the day marker right there in the dark blue doesn't fit into the screen, and in fact goes quite a bit further. We had some interesting little buy setups that as soon as they presented themselves, they met the target. In this case, we were coming down, didn't quite get to the 0% on the setup because we never had a white MBI lead from that standpoint. But once red was in the lead, I was jumping on this one, even though we were still at the 23%. It took a little teeny pop to 38, but then proceeded all the way lower because white MBI got above, and we went all the way back to the zeros. And then it just kept peaking MBI white above. There was no point to be concerned about a turnaround at that stage. And even with this red leading, we had just a divergent setup here, because oftentimes when the red leads, you get a pullback, particularly under 50%, but in this case the magenta moved past it and stayed above. So it wasn't until that turnaround point, which I was right about there, with the crossover, and kind of held flat within that, but then produced a secondary one with the white MBI spike, and that's where things started to get interesting, because came down but didn't quite get to the zero, made another pop. And this is a portion that I pointed out. Every time that you see an MBI white by itself, particularly above 40 on that print, no matter the scenarios I looked at, even if price moves divergent, meaning going to the upside of it, it always comes back to that price. So if taking this opportunity to short there produced an upside move, you would still expect it to come back to that point. So it acts kind of like a positive extreme in that aspect. It doesn't happen too often, but I mean, on a 5K chart, there are hundreds of examples, and I can only find one failure in all those hundreds of examples. So that's an impressive thing to have. And in this particular case, that white peak led to a move to 0%, clean and simple. Magenta stayed over for a while, but then finally it was the blue rising above the gray, as well as the magenta getting clear of yellow in that sparked the turnaround. And clear of the yellow dots was clean buy from that point, but produced another brief short that turned around because we ended up dipping with cyan under red right after this setup, and boom, that led to a spurt back up to the highs, and that is where it just continued to tread water going across. But every time there was a near meeting between the white and magenta popped above. As long as that happens, you don't tend to get any breakdown from those early readings. And so when it popped again, we had the white MBI above, not quite above the 40. In this particular case, 34 needs to get to about 38 to have it be the strongest predominance. So usually when I see these, I'm not expecting more than just a dip towards the 50% range. And interestingly enough, as soon as right before the bell, we ended up with the sell signal, and then it proceeded to cascade lower right afterwards. So I'd be looking for at least a test down to that 75 range potentially in the after hours. It could be even the Asian or European session before it happens. We also have MBI white leading that one. So that is a pretty big day. It was fantastic from a trade standpoint because everything was doing just as expected. And the fact that once we got back above that 64 range, you'll see the 68's mark because it's a positive extreme from right here. We ended up with it starting right there. So break down to the 50 that goes slightly below, that would be the fill part all the way down to 68. If it doesn't, that'll be interesting because I would look for that during regular session on any weakness as a focus target point, which are always helpful because every time we had even little positive extremes like back in this one, came back, filled it, and those make for good targets, particularly when you have a specific range and you can have an expectation exactly what the return will be based on that. So keep that in mind. There won't be any report for Thursday, and certainly just depends on where I'm at for Friday whether we'll have one, but otherwise there'll be one set up for Monday beginning post-holiday, and we'll go from there. As always though, trade well. We'll talk again later.